Hi, everyone. Welcome. We've done so many of these. I thought it would be helpful to start off by saying that today is Thursday, May 14th. We're really happy that you're with us again. This is Let's Grow Kids' sixth online real-time training. Our topic today is preparing to reopen, updates on business supports and resources for your childcare business. I'm Emily Blistein. I'm the Director of Business Strategy at Let's Grow Kids. For today's training, we're happy to be joined by Lawrence Miller of Five Vine Consulting and John Hollar of Downs Rachlin Martin. We'll have about the usual 30 minutes to hear from our panelists and then about 25 for questions. I'm going to go through my usual list of reminders. I just did my outside of my door, yell to my family that I am recording and they can't talk now. So just to remind you, we are at home with our kids and our animals and our various states of internet. So things may get disrupted, but we've been pretty lucky so far. You are all muted. There are a lot of you. So we cannot see you and you are muted. Also, today's training has been approved for Northern Lights Professional Development. When you registered, you should have registered with your BFIS number. If you have any questions about that, though, you can email Ansley. She'll be doing a follow-up email to this, this training as well. And as always, sorry, I think I'm getting ahead of her with my slides. I would encourage you to look at our Let's Grow Kids coronavirus page. It has a ton of updates, a ton of past trainings, and we have resources for early educators, parents, and employers there. This is usually the time in the intro that I give a little update about using the Q&A instead of the chat box, and I would encourage you to use the Q&A. However, there are a lot of you, over 200, close to 300 of you registered for this webinar. And so what we found is that when there's questions coming in all the time, it can be harder for us to make good use of our Q&A time. Also, I know for me personally, if I have questions that I'm trying to ask during a presentation, I have a hard time listening. So I'd really encourage you to take a moment right now, open your Stickies tab on your computer or get a piece of paper. If you have questions as we're going through, please write them down, but please do try to hold them if you can to our Q&A section. I would really encourage you to put them in our Q&A section. We've designed this training so that, we've heard a ton of your questions coming in, so we really have designed it to answer those questions. But if during the Q&A you have unresolved questions, please do put them in. That gets saved for us in an Excel document. So if we can't answer them live, we will get back in touch with you. That's also another opportunity to remind you that we are still offering free legal and business consultations for you. So if something comes up that's really personal to you, I would really encourage you to reach out on that. There it is, that form on our website, so that we can help match you with our consultants. Okay. So today is a big one. The training is focused on considerations for reopening. And I just want to acknowledge at the outset that this, everybody's been saying these are really extraordinary times. And you all have many incredibly legitimate concerns, and satisfactory answers just don't exist for all of the concerns you have. I personally owned a small business on Main Street for 7 years. So as I'm hearing all of these new guidance and new information changing every day, I'm thinking about what I would have done. And I know that your concerns about the health and safety for you and your family are often in conflict for what you feel like you need to do for your business or for the families that you serve. So I just want to recognize that. We all are recognizing that it's a real concern, and we can't make that tension go away between those two things. But our goal today is to really help you weigh the pros and cons of different options so that you can move forward from that concern to making the safest and healthiest decisions for yourselves, your family, and your business. And that's going to be different for each one of you, and that's okay. I do want to direct you to two trainings we hosted. Let's Grow Kids hosted on Tuesday, May 12th. They will be in our drop-down webinars menu. One is with Dr. Brina Holmes, and one was with Luann Beninati. I think that Ansley can put those in the chat, the links to those. Those have a lot of other great background information about health and safety and reopening concerns that can help flesh out this bigger discussion. So with the slide with the governor, I just want to sort of level set. This is what we know right now, though honestly in the last hour, I think a few things may have been added. So the governor's issued a new order that allows childcare to reopen on June 1. The childcare stabilization funding that we've talked about for the past few sessions here does end on May 31st. Some additional guidance about health and safety precautions came out yesterday, and there's going to be more to come, and we'll talk about that later on in the presentation. There will be restart grants to help with PPE and other restart needs, and more information on that is coming. I do want to address, just before I turn it over to the panelists, one final concern that I'm hearing from the early educator community, that childcare is now being talked about as an economic issue, just as a way to get people back to work. And I think that that frustration is really valid. I just want to note that within our community, we understand how crucial these early years are. We're well versed in talking about that. But for many other people in the government and in the business world and just throughout our community, this is their door into this issue. And with that, they're talking about it as an economic issue because that's how they understand it. But I would encourage all of us to look at this as an opportunity to continue opening that door so that everybody can understand that, yes, a stable, robust childcare system is completely fundamental to our economy, but the ultimate value is in the work that you're doing, helping our children's brains grow and develop. So we're using that at Let's Grow Kids as an opportunity to broaden the discussion, and we'd really encourage you to do the same in your communities. So thank you. Again, I'm going to turn it over to Lawrence Miller. I just want to remind you that you're all the ultimate decision makers about what path is right to you. We are here to help. We don't have all of the answers, but we do have some really sound advice from these experts. And I would encourage you, if in this you feel like you still have more personal questions, to reach out to us with those. Thank you. And Lawrence, I'll turn it over to you.
Terrific. Thank you, Emily. And I just want to echo what you said about the use of language in different venues. And I am one of those who chooses to use the language of key economic development infrastructure when talking to people in the legislature and appropriators, because it's something I've found that they understand and are sensitive to. It's not the same thing as what we say in terms of what's relevant to all audiences. And I do want to acknowledge that. We believe deeply in supporting you in your authentic mission, and those are not always the same things as what's going to motivate a funder in the legislature. And so as you work with us to think about how to communicate with parents, how to communicate with your legislators, remember that all communication happens in the mind of the listeners. So how you get to them listening is really important. And it doesn't feel, I recognize it right now, it really doesn't feel like being heard when we have these announcements come forward and we're in the responsive mode. And this has been true for all of the sectors I work with. Frankly, there's been a string of Friday announcements for Monday implementation that have left many of us who work with businesses scrambling over the weekend to help them respond. So I'm glad we've got a couple of weeks to help you respond, but we also recognize that this is crunch time. Could we go to the timing slide? The health and safety consideration. Sorry, I jumped one. I think one of the things that is important to recognize is that there is a lot in the updated guidance that went from 9 pages to 13 pages that's in there. A lot of it is very important to understand. There's no shortcuts to it. You really want to be able to follow these guidelines to the best of your ability, and I'll let John chime in here about what that does for you from a liability perspective. But you know, we've heard loud and clear that for all of you, the question of health and safety is the premier question, vastly more important to you than financial considerations. So we will spend some time on that today. John?
Yeah, so as Lawrence said, compliance with obligations for childcare facilities is the best way to protect yourself from liability. That's probably easier said than done given the voluminous nature of them. So one thing to think about is prioritizing to the extent that you need to look at those obligations that are clearly mandatory, that say that where the requirement is that you shall do this, as opposed to ones that say you should or may consider. In an ideal world, you do all of them. That may not be possible given the scope of them in the short time period. So think about prioritizing, and ones that are mandatory really are required. But the best way, as Laura said, and I want to underscore that, if you're concerned about liability, the best way to protect yourself is through compliance. That establishes two things: compliance with state obligation, but also establishes what is the standard for best practice within your industry, which is what courts look to determine whether an entity has been negligent in the face of a lawsuit.
And there is a question about waivers, which are a very common question. And the fact is that the waivers in Vermont just don't have a whole lot of strength. And what we're dealing with here is a community spread item, so that there's not a huge amount of connection to your center in general, to your program, but waivers don't tend to do a whole lot in Vermont. Let's go on to timing. So this really relates to that sense really relates to waiting until you and your facility really are ready to open. And I use the phrase gates, not dates. We can't just do this on the calendar. The governor's announcement is permissive in nature. You may open on June 1st, but if you're not ready, be prepared to resist your parents, be prepared to resist pressures. And this is really hard. We recognize it's really hard. They've said you can open, you don't have to, but we're also going to end the stabilization funding. And I mean, that's just an incredibly frustrating position to be put in, to say, hey, we may need extra time to be ready, but there's not necessarily cash flow to support that. Let's Grow Kids is going to be advocating for a little bit more flexibility there, so that people aren't put in a position of having to choose between safety and finance. But we recognize that the way this has come out really does put you in a little bit of that position. But I'd really like you to take, as you look through the health guidelines, think about what it looks like to be truly ready to go, and build yourself a checklist that says, okay, I am ready to open on June 1st, or I need to go to June 5th, or whatever date that might be. That includes staff training and reorientation first, to make sure everybody understands what they need to do. That's getting people together, physically distant with masks on at the center, and really walking through how that facility is going to work and how it's going to work differently, and how to accommodate those mandatory things and make decisions about the permissive things. I think this is also super important to think about how you can communicate to parents, vendors who might come in, staff who are not directly involved in childcare, and think through all of those mechanisms. There's going to be a lot that goes on, and the people who are open today serving the children of essential workers have experience with this. There's a lot going on when kids arrive, and no matter how much pre-planning you do for everybody to arrive in different 5-minute increments, there's going to be situations where you've got a bunch of people arriving at once. So communicating with your parents beforehand about what your expectations are, whether you can use Zoom or one-on-one phone calls or whatever you can do to give them some advanced training and expectations about what you need from their behavior when they arrive. And Emily, you want to talk a little bit about the peanut-free example that you used the other day? That was great.
Brenda, I think.
Yes, so apologies. I was dealing with a bumblebee that just came into my dining room, which is the space where we are meeting together. And my cat is very interested in that, so that led to some events. So yes, just sort of thinking about how when something comes our way that we have to deal with, and it's new, And there's sort of not precedent, at least in our programs. I harken back to being a classroom teacher and then a director when peanut allergies and tree nut allergies came in, and how not only do we have to change our policies and educate, not the staff, but also the families. And then we had to practice vigilance, vigilance, vigilance. And that's, I felt like it's not even remotely the same, but it was the best analogy that I could come up with in recent history that perhaps many of us can relate to.
Thank you. I think in any situation where there's frustration like this, I come back to that question of how do you recognize what you can control and what you can't. And in a moment, we'll come back to alternatives that give you a little bit more choice perhaps than you feel like you're having right now. But we really do want you to be able to make the best decision. And that means being able to get clear of those high pressures. So I go back a few weeks ago when I talked about maintaining a risk register or risk log to get these things out of your brain. This is going to be another situation where it's important to go back and get those things that are worrying you out of your brain and onto a piece of paper, and then think about how to mitigate those concerns and really understand what you control and what you can't, and not try to control things that you can't. We might be able to influence them, particularly if we all work together, but we might not be able to control any individual component ourselves. And that's going to wind up with a lot of creativity as well, and relying on creativity that you and your staff have for your particular situation. And I think of this, somebody's asking about the requirement for wearing masks all day and how do you eat and drink. And, in a couple of manufacturing facilities I work with, people are taking all their breaks in their cars because the lunchroom and break room are closed under the guidance. And so they're finding that people like to have the quiet in their car as being their best alternative. And let's go on to the next slide and ask John to pick this up.
Okay, thank you, Lawrence. So I'm going to talk a little bit first about unemployment compensation. As you continue to work through the various options that are available to you, it's important to understand unemployment compensation, both the existing Vermont law and the changes that both Vermont and the federal government have made. So I'm going to talk briefly about both of those. First, the state law, and then I'll talk about the federal law. So traditionally, unemployment compensation benefits are available to individuals who lose their jobs. They're either furloughed or terminated from his or her job. And they're available whether that termination is temporary or it's permanent. Benefits equal about 58% of the individual's prior weekly wages. The Vermont legislature passed a bill in April, signed by the governor, that significantly expands unemployment insurance eligibility. It's effective until March 31st of 2021. So as I mentioned, temporarily or traditionally, unemployment insurance is available if individuals are terminated. Act 91, this new law, creates new categories of eligibility for individuals who haven't lost their jobs. They're departing from the workforce due to some COVID-related experience. Now, eligibility, and I'm going to walk through each of those categories, but just underscore that eligibility is not unlimited. You have to fall within one of these, and that's become somewhat of an issue because unemployment has become, for many people, more attractive because they can make more money on unemployment than not. But if a job is available and you don't fall within one of these categories, you can't, of course, be on unemployment. All right, so let me walk through these five categories really that you ought to be aware of. There are really three that are most relevant for you to consider. The first, and I think the most significant, is that an individual can take unemployment, can decline employment if they are designated as being part of a high-risk category, if they're exposed to or infected with COVID-19. And that includes individuals who are age 65 or older, or individuals who have a medical condition that puts them at a higher risk. So that would include individuals with heart disease, lung disease, immune disorders, and pregnant women. So that's the first category. individuals who are at a higher risk. Second category would be individuals who are at and claim that they are at an unreasonable risk of exposure in the workplace. And that term, that phrase, unreasonable risk of exposure, is defined under Vermont law. It means a workplace that's not in compliance with relevant state or federal guidance. So in this case, that would be the guidance that was issued yesterday for childcare facilities. Now, given the scope of that guidance, the 13 pages, the many obligations that are at least recommendations, the guidance that's included, it's not going to be difficult, I don't think, for any individual to say that a given workplace is not in compliance. So that could be a significant category as well for individuals who don't choose to work and choose to take unemployment under that category.
John, I'm going to interrupt you for a second, encourage you to move a little closer to, I think we're all sitting a little further away than usual. We're all having
How's that? Is that better, Emily?
Yep, sounds good. Thanks.
Okay, yes, my apologies. Okay, the third category is an individual who leaves the workplace to care for a child because their school is closed or a child care provider is unavailable. That also, of course, is a very significant category for anyone who has a child in public education right now, certainly for the rest of the year, and then we'll see for the school year in the fall. The last two categories have less relevance, I think, but they're important for you to understand. An individual is eligible for unemployment if they've left to self-isolate or quarantine due to some either exposure or actually having contracted COVID-19. So anyone who has actually experienced COVID-19 is going to be eligible for unemployment, not surprising. And then the last category, broad category, would include anyone who leaves employment to care for somebody, a family member who's in one of these other categories, somebody who's been exposed to COVID-19, has contracted it, or to care for a family member who faces an unreasonable risk of exposure. So those are the 5 general categories. As Emily said, we're available if you have questions about any of those to follow up with you and to talk through those if you have questions. Important to note, and this is also a significant change from prior law, and that is that an employer will not be charged against their experience rating with benefits that are paid to an employee who leaves the workforce as a result of one of those criteria. Okay, so that's state law. And then I'll just briefly mention federal law. Most of you are going to be familiar with the 2 changes that I'm going to mention. The first is that benefits are now available for the first time for self-employed individuals who are unable to work, including individuals who are independent contractors, anybody who runs their own business, many of you. This is the so-called Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Program, or PUA. This program largely just piggybacks state law administered by the Department of Labor, same level of benefits up to 26 weeks. The benefits are a little more challenging to determine because they're based on prior income rather than actual wages. And of course, you probably read this was a very difficult program for the state to create, but they've largely cleared through the large backlog of claims and are now processing claims pretty regularly. That benefit is available through the end of this year, 2020. And then finally, the Federal CARES Act created a supplemental benefit of $600 a week for both individuals and those who are self-employed who receive benefits under the PUA program. So that's a very significant addition for both unemployed, the self-employed, and individuals. And that benefit is much shorter in duration unless Congress extends it. That expires at the end of July. All right, so that concludes my discussion about unemployment. Lawrence, back to you.
Sure. One of the things that we had been wondering about, we didn't really get an answer to. We had been concerned if opening at 10 or fewer, that there would be a real jam on the question of how we would, how slots would be allocated, whether the state would be making that difficult determination, prioritizing people, or if it would wind up being up to you. And I think what we have the sense of now is that it will be up to you on figuring out, if you don't have capacity for all of your families, how you prioritize acceptance among them. I don't have any good advice for you. other than to say, I think this, if you pursue this with compassion and really talk to people about what their needs are, that would be really advantageous. You can work with Let's Grow Kids program teams. We'll work with CDD, but the whole idea of being able to use an update to the essential worker guidance did not work out as I was hoping, at any rate. I think this question of who, if you think through it, the state modeling assumes that about half of the workforce is able to work from home and will continue to work from home. So it's unclear to me who will need to be accommodated and who may continue to keep their kids at home. I mean, these are just things we won't know until your families are reaching out for you with their requests. Brenda, would you like to add to this?
I am going to, that's a great question, Lawrence. I wish I could add answers. I don't really have anything of substance to add. I think that what you said was the sort of compassionate conversations is where we begin. And I know folks are really doing that already.
So I think that's the idea of going through and asking them, what do they really need? And we always try to help people differentiate between what they want and what they need. And if you've got a number of people in the healthcare field in your population, you may have to be in the position of saying, yeah, I'm gonna prioritize those folks. And if you've got a few parents who are still able to work from home and you're in a jam, then I think you'll need to adjust a little bit. Given that it did go up, as somebody noted, it did go up to 25 in the guidance, I think we will have less pressure than we were worried about originally. But I'll observe that 25 is a forecast at this time. And what we have seen to date is the size of group gatherings and the size of childcare groups matching themselves. So I'm not convinced that we will, I don't think we can take for granted if the data changes, we won't be at 25. If the data doesn't change, I think we'll see expansion of groups outside of childcare come up to 25 in June. But we need to understand that this may go up and down. We are seeing resurgence of disease in South Korea and Lebanon, both places that had fairly complete suppression, like Vermont. And as we open our restrictions somewhat, we are expecting that there will be flare-ups, and we're going to have to expect to flex with that up and down. Next slide. All of which makes planning for cash flow and payroll really hard, especially in the absence of the stabilization plan. And we are looking at, I think idle funding is pretty well closed out at this point. We expect the current round of PPP to be funded out fairly soon. The tax credits for sick leave and family leave are administratively simple and inexhaustible by their nature. They're not a budgeted item, they're a tax expenditure. We do think that there is, well, CDD is making a really big effort to get cash out for the startup expenses on an allocation basis ahead of June 1st. You may have startup costs that are not well matched, or longer term improvements that you need to make to your facility to accommodate the changed requirements, like some curtain walls or things like that, in which case the SBA Express loans may wind up being another useful tool for you. And then if you do have residual stabilization program revenue that you've been holding on to, that has been made clear that that's fungible money. It didn't need to be spent on payroll. You can use it flexibly as you need to come back online. Trey, is there anything you want to add to that stabilization revenue component at this time?
No, and thank you, Lawrence. That is the most important thing there to underscore is that it is not intended on the state side, on the CDD side, to have any limitations that would prevent you being part of those other programs. And so that's really, we wanted to emphasize that for folks today, is that if you have been receiving those and you're able to save those dollars or allocate them to expenses down the road, that's totally legitimate. This is revenue in the door that is yours to use in the way that is best for your needs.
Yes. Couple of clarifying questions. Let me just touch on here about the number 25. The number 25 is per discrete area. So if you have a classroom that accommodates 25, and this would be individuals, including kiddos and teachers and staff, that's a unit. If you only have a half wall separating two areas, those are not two classrooms physically then. And so it would flow across the space. So it's really going to depend a lot on what your physical layout is, and working through the guidance that came out and understanding that as you physically walk around your place. That's the way I find it best to do it. It's really good to go through there and say, oh, are the things I haven't recognized? Am I missing a door that would actually make a space, a discrete space? Could I use a curtain or something to modify it? Those are going to be really practical questions in terms of what can work for you. And why don't we kick it back to John for a discussion about liability and workers' comp.
Okay, so I know a lot of you probably have questions about workers' compensation, how it applies here, what the benefits are, and so on. So let me just run through that really briefly. First, I should mention that that workers' compensation benefits are available already under current law if an employee contracts COVID-19 at work. We usually think of workers' compensation as being available if somebody's injured on the job, but the scope is somewhat broader than that and does cover COVID-19 under current law. The Vermont Senate has passed a bill that creates a presumption that if an individual is infected by COVID-19 and they work in a certain occupation like a child care worker, that infection is presumed to have occurred on the job and would be subject to workers' compensation coverage. So it would make it easier for an individual to file a claim for workers' compensation if they contracted it and can argue that it occurred at work. I think that only changes eligibility somewhat, but it's also unclear whether that bill is going to pass. It's pending in the House. There's quite a bit of opposition to it. The governor has suggested he may not support it. So I don't think at this time it looks like it's going to pass, although they're, of course, uncertain. But like I say, it's not going to dramatically change eligibility, I don't think. So it also just mentioned that you may not be covered under a workers' compensation policy if you're self-employed or you're an owner. The law generally doesn't require that you carry workers' compensation coverage for yourself. You are obligated to carry it for an employee. But it's something that you may want to consider. Policies are expensive, but they provide wage replacement benefits as well as medical benefits in the event that you're injured on the job, including contracted COVID-19. So it's worth at least exploring that as an option. So I think just generally speaking, it's important for you to understand your insurance benefits. Make sure that if you have employees or if you're considering having your own workers' compensation coverage, make sure that you have that coverage in place. Go over your policies with your insurance agent. Make sure that you purchase the insurance coverage that's right for you and your business, and that you understand what benefits are available, what risks are covered by your existing policies. Lawrence, I'll turn it back to you.
Well, I'm not sure that is Emily or Trey going to address the position paper?
I
is
am
actually
going to address
Brenda.
that.
Brenda.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, so we hear you. I think we've said that every week. And as someone who spent 25 years in classrooms and 5 of those as a program director, I feel it with you. So I just want to share some really good news, and that is that we at LGK are actively recommending solutions in response to what you've been sharing with us. And in response to your concerns, your questions, and also to, we share your concerns and your questions in response to the pandemic. So I'll just highlight the points and then say a little bit about them. We are recommending that the Restart grants offer flexible support to childcare programs and the families that you serve. We are recommending that the Child Care Financial Assistance Program be based on enrollment and not attendance, as it currently is. We are recommending that all of you should have access to PPE and supplies through state procurement processes, because you are, as healthcare providers you are providing care that requires PPE, and so meaning protective equipment, and in the same way that healthcare providers have access to the supplies through state procurement process and then don't have to be sort of individually hunting it down, we'd like the same for you. We're also recommending that the BFIS infrastructure gets some more much needed investments immediately. Part of the dilemma of the offset payments in the past 8 weeks and the delays and the overpayments are direct results of that. And everyone is aware of that. And I'm happy to say that there already are things happening to correct that. We say, let's do more and now. We also recommend that we continue to and invest more in wage supplements for you through 2020. So those of you who are providing care to children of essential workers have had some wage supplementation during the time of providing this care. And we're saying that's great, and we need more, we need for it to continue. So I just want to go back a little bit more about the flexibility. With the Restart grants, we're concerned that the 6 million isn't going to be the 6 million that's already pledged. Yay for 6 million. We're concerned that that's not going to be sufficient to support the reopening costs for everyone, and so that's why we're asking for some additional and flexibility. And we think that the grants should be based on a formula instead of an application process. There's already so much going on. We think, wouldn't it be great if there was sort of an algorithm where you could plug in your information, so what your license capacity is, for example, and so you're already operating, and make that connected to what you're eligible for. Yeah, so I think I don't want to spend a lot of time going through this. Our position statement is going to go public later today, I believe, so everyone will have a chance to read more of those details. I do want to touch back just briefly on the question that Lawrence posed to me earlier about how to decide who to invite back first as you reopen. And in addition to compassion, I think it was stated, but sort of maybe the 3 C's: compassion, communication, and collaboration. So yes, talking with our families, finding out what they need, and then collaborating with them about what works best for them. And so some of your families are saying, please let me come back first at 6:30 a.m. And some of your families are saying, please take it easy. I want to be safe. I want you to be safe. I want my kids to be safe. So all that communication, compassion, communication, collaboration. And we're going to move into your questions, and I just want to reiterate that we can't get to all of the questions in live time in sort of satisfactory ways, and many of your questions, so some of your questions we've already covered or touched on at least, and some of your questions are going to be better answered if you reach out for the one-on-one consultation, either with Don or Lawrence or somebody from Let's Grow Kids. And also, you know, we understand that everything is emerging, and that in this time of so many uncertainties, I just want to say that we continue to seek clarity and to partner best practices with requirements and recommendations, and we understand that requirements and recommendations are two different things, and what is the tension between those. So Emily, do you want to lead with some questions, and then we'll tag Schmidt? Thank you.
So I do. My internet just bumped me off, and I was able to get back on just before the question and answer, but all of my questions and answers are now gone. So I do remember a few, so I'm going to start with those. The first is that this webinar will be recorded, so sometimes it is helpful to watch it again. There's a ton of information here. And also, there were some questions about liability for Brenda. There was one in particular about whether or not there were waiver forms for, do you have that one? I thought that would be a good place to start.
I know that it's very, I know where it is. Interested in a legal question or document, do you have a waiver for childcare programs to protect for liability due to COVID-19?
Yeah, so Lawrence touched on this earlier, and I'll just reiterate what he said, that a liability waiver in Vermont is not going to get you very far. You can't waive liability for your negligence if you were considered to be negligent. So it's just not going to give you much protection. You could have some kind of disclosure form where a parent acknowledges the practices that you're following, which could be relevant, and we might want to follow up with you in more detail about that. But in terms of a general waiver, it's really not going to be useful to you.
There was also a question about the timing for the additional $600. And just to clarify, that is through the end of July.
That's right. Yeah, and that benefit tracks either state or federal unemployment benefits generally. So you have to be eligible for either Vermont unemployment or the pandemic unemployment assistance program to get the additional $600. So it's an add-on to what you would otherwise receive in unemployment benefits.
Another question is related to the type of program. So are employees of church-owned childcare centers eligible for the PUI, since churches are exempt from paying into the traditional unemployment insurance program?
Yes, they would be. Well, the PUA is only available for the self-employed, so no, in that context, if they were employees of a church, then yes, they would be eligible for traditional unemployment benefits.
Thank you.
There's a question about programs that only run during the public school year. If they aren't planning to reopen until the fall, will there still be a restart grant money available then, and what other resources?
I think that's one of those things that we don't yet know. I look at the $6 million that's allocated to the restart, and I'm not entirely sure that that will have the capacity to go on to the fall, but we certainly hope that that program will be used at all of the points that it's needed to get people going again.
Emily, did you have another question in queue?
Nope, you go right ahead.
Okay, so I heard one of you speak to this, and I think, so just seeking clarification, did I understand correctly about unemployment, that employers won't be charged for unemployment if the staff who chose not to return are claiming it?
That's right, if they fall within one of the categories that I discussed. They'd have to fall within one of those, then you're not charged. If it's for some other reason, then you would be charged.
And certainly if you have an employee who files for unemployment but isn't qualified under one of these areas, or for example, you've offered them suitable work that is similar to what they've had in the past, they would not be eligible unless they fit one of these special categories.
And
We've
so
heard
Claire, go ahead.
Our eloquent dance is a little off with my internet service today. I was just going to ask, somebody asked a question about hazard pay. I know we've heard little bits about that on and off over the past few weeks. What do we know about hazard pay right now? Is there any word on it for essential employees or
Sure.
early educators?
Yeah, I'll discuss that briefly. That did receive a lot of attention in the Senate. The Senate passed a bill that included a hazardous pay program for fairly broad range of employees who interface mostly with the public, and includes childcare workers. That bill is pending in the House. By its terms, it expires, I think, tomorrow on May 15th. So the House has taken a pretty skeptical look at that. I think it's unlikely at this point, given the price tag, given the fact that it would largely be retroactive. It was originally designed to be an incentive program to keep employees at work in the face of high unemployment benefits that I mentioned, that were creating an incentive for some employees not to return. If it's retroactive, that really doesn't accomplish that goal. So I'm at this point going to say I don't think it's likely that that's going to become law.
And a point of clarification around the Paycheck Protection Plan, the PPP. So someone said now the PPP is asking for certification that we did not receive revenue elsewhere. Is that for forgiveness purposes?
We would expect that to be for forgiveness purposes, but it's important to understand that Treasury has not released the final rules on forgiveness. There's still a great deal we're uncertain about as to how that will work, particularly for self-employed, where it's a measurement against your scheduled revenue from your business. So I think this is one of those things, and there was another question about the interplay between stabilization and PPP. If you've clearly used PPP for revenue replacement or for wage replacement, the fact that you had other income isn't necessarily going to make that unforgivable. It's that you can't use both for the same purpose. So if you've had PPP and you've kept your stabilization funds off in a corner because you've been making payroll with PPP, then that stabilization fund will be available at the end of your 8-week period for other expenses. But I wish we had the guidance, but we don't yet. So hold your breath.
And cross your fingers and toes. I know that's not very scientific. A question about what kind of supports, do we know what supports are available for programs who have families who aren't ready to come back on June 1st, but a program's bottom line depends on their enrollment?
Yeah, and this is one of those areas where the end of the stabilization payments and the other payments and the crossover to the restart program is where we have a little bit as yet unknown until we get that final guidance as to how restart will be allocated and what its purposes will be.
We have, I think, a lot of people who don't want to return to work, but a lot also that do, that fall into those high-risk categories. So this question is specifically if there are staff that are at risk, but who want to return to work. Is there something, what should that employer take? Should they have them sign something? What can they do?
Well, I think if you look at the guidance, it says that these individuals should not provide childcare unless discussed with a healthcare provider. So if you have staff members or teachers age 65 or older, or with serious underlying health conditions, encourage them to talk to their healthcare provider to assess their risk and determine if they should stay home. This is not a decision you need to make unilaterally, and not a decision you need to make on behalf of an adult who works for you. It is something you need to be sure that they understand that they may be at risk. And the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission has waived this restriction against talking to employees about their health conditions for this purpose. So you want to make sure they're making an informed choice, but you don't have to make the choice for them.
I would just go one step further as well and say that it's entirely appropriate, and I think probably prudent, to say if an employee is in one of those categories, that are age 65 or older, or have one of those medical conditions, that they obtain a statement from a physician saying that it's appropriate for them to return to work, and to require that as an employer. And if they don't have it, it's appropriate for you, if you choose, to say that they're not able to return to work until they have that guidance, that clearance from a physician.
There are a number of questions about supplies and supply sources, and so while there aren't any hard and fast answers right now, I can tell you that one of the things that we're actively working on, as I shared briefly in the slide earlier, is giving childcare programs access to Vermont's procurement process, which would allow programs to get what you need. And so we know that the prices have in some cases increased, but also just finding things available has become a challenge. And Let's Grow Kids did work to ameliorate that for about 6 weeks. And with a small pot of money that we had, that's been exhausted. What we've tried to do is establish some regional hubs with suppliers where we can connect people. The nuts and bolts of that are still being worked out. If we can actually get movement on being invited into Vermont's procurement process, then perhaps that will certainly that would alleviate this dilemma. And I know that's a great concern for balancing, well, for meeting the health requirements, right, and practicing health and safety, and being able to reopen.
And I would add that on our coronavirus page for early educators, there is a link for resources. Foley Distribution in Rutland was really helpful in that process before, and they're specifically helping us with childcare providers now. I'm going to drop the link into everyone to that resource page right now.
Yeah, and I think I just want to, set expectations at appropriate level. The state procurement process, doesn't do a lot for much for the state organizations themselves. So cleaning supplies and that sort of thing, we had worked with Foley Distributing to set up a program, and we'll continue to work to expand that. The state procurement system is really focused on PPE from the State Emergency Operations Center perspective, and they've told the dentists the other day that they're on their own for finding PPE. So I'm not sure what to expect from that, and I would urge you all to work towards commercial and industrial supply and cooperative purchasing if possible, rather than to rely on that outcome. I'm trying to set it up as a backstop, as a safety, but I wouldn't trust that will be your primary solution.
So I want to just say a little bit more about that too. Thank you, Lawrence. I'm a little deflated with that information, but I'm a realist, so thank you for being real with us. I also know that places like Foley are trying to figure out how to do that because they're not in the individual retail business. And so I was in conversation just this morning with some folks in Rutland, where Foley is located, who are working on leveraging their network buying power, and Foley is willing to work with them. They're trying to figure out what that would look like and how distribution would work. But those are the kinds of things that are happening regionally. And if you are a leader of a network formerly known perhaps as Starting Points, Vermont Early Childhood Network, that might be something you consider. If you have access to a regional hub through shared services, that's another place that we're working to make the asks and to figure out how to get how to match people and programs and supplies. And I see we're getting close to end of time. Emily, what other questions do you see?
Well, I see some questions around the reality that some of your staff may be able to return to work and others of your staff may not be able to return to work, and just how do you manage the numbers of your families that may be returning and not returning. I feel like Brenda and Lawrence, you've touched on this a little bit, but if you have any sort of final words, I feel like that's a real concern just about staffing and ratios.
Yeah, in particular, we've seen this morale question of how do people who come back to work feel about people who are staying on unemployment. One thing that some employers have done is to bring everybody back part-time instead of bringing a few people back full-time. It really depends on what works best for your workforce. We are all going to have different numbers of people who are in that vulnerable category and may or may not be able or willing to return to work, absent the dynamic of unemployment insurance. So I think this goes back to how do you have those conversations with the 3 C's, as Brenda put it, for your employees as well as with your families. And I recognize we are leaving people with just about as many questions as they came to today with. We do look forward to this becoming more clear as we get towards June 1st. And it is one of those reasons that we are encouraging gates, not dates, because there is that challenge as things evolve of needing to come back and say, okay, based on what I assumed, am I really ready?
I would also say I saw a number of questions in the Q&A we don't have time to answer now, but that we will answer in writing after this webinar is over.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Lawrence.
Well, I was just noticing somebody said the recommendation about part-time is not consistent with the health department recommendations of people having the same children throughout the day and limiting exposure. In a cohort model, we do it across the full day. So it's a question of, does somebody work 5 days, or one person work 3 days and one person work 2 days. So I don't mean to imply that you should mix cohorts. That cohort division is super important, Kathy, and you're right to point that out.
So just to reiterate what has been said throughout, while I'm wrapping it up here, please continue to drop any remaining questions, even if there are more than you started with, in that Q&A function. If you've put a question in the chat that hasn't been answered, please cut and paste it over into the Q&A section, because that's what we can save and get back to you on. Again, if there are questions that you want one-on-one support with, we can do that, and I would direct you again to the Let's Grow Kids coronavirus page. There is a little form where you can input your information and we can match you with John or Lawrence or one of the other experts that we've had on over the past few weeks of these trainings. I also want to remind you that there are resources on Shared Services Vermont, a lot of things that you can just print out easily and not have to create yourself for some of these new regulations. We're trying to get a lot of stuff up to minimize the amount of work that you have to do. So sharedservicesvt.org. And this is all up on the final slide. Again, all of these will be available on our website. It is under the webinar heading, but we know they're not called webinars anymore. So do look for it there. Also, for individual staff members and yourselves, I want to remind you that we do have an emergency member loan with VSECU that provides early educators across the state. You can access loans of up to $2,000 with no interest. We are funding that $25 membership fee and paying your first month's loan payment. So if any of your staff are coming to you with financial concerns of their own, remember that that's a really great not very low debt situation that can help them out for their families. There are links on here. There's so much that's come out in the last few days. So we've got a link on there to the Department of Health's new health and safety guidance for childcare programs, the Department of Health, and all of the other resources that have been popping up lately. You can find those on the coronavirus webpage. Thank you all again. This was a big one, and we would really encourage you to look back through. We do an FAQ for these webinars as well. Oftentimes, it's really helpful to read through that. If you've got questions, I saw some questions pop up about what is the PPP and all these other things that we've been talking about throughout the last few weeks. So please look back there and get in touch with us if we can be helpful in any other way. Thank you very much.